Good afternoon and welcome to the January webinar put on by the Dibble Institute. Today we're delighted to have Dr. Scott Stanley with us, who is going to talk about and give us the most recent updates on his research on quote unquote sliding versus deciding, which is a term that he coined several years ago. So excited to hear from Scott. I'm Kay Reed, I'm the executive director of this organization. And I want to acknowledge my colleagues, Esther and Emily, who are behind the scenes making all the gears turn and make this go smoothly. So thank you, Esther and Emily. For some housekeeping tips, if you lose your audio, in the invitation you got or the registration form is a phone number that you can call in on if you lose your audio. Otherwise, do what most people do when their technology doesn't work and go to webinar off and turn it back on and you'll probably be fine. We're going to be using the question box a lot in this webinar. Dr. Stanley wants to make this conversational, so please orient yourself to your control panel and where the question box is, because we want to hear from you. Finally, we're going to use the raise hand feature, and we're going to start with that right now. If you could identify your raise my hand feature, and please raise your hand if this is the very first Dibble webinar you have ever attended, and I will give you 10 seconds to do that, maybe 5. It shouldn't take long, but give you a little bit of time to tell me if you're new to a Dibble webinar. Great. Out of the more than 200 people of you, about 20 or 15% are new to us. So thank you for coming. It's like Christmas when I open the registration form and there's people I know and organizations that are our clients, and it's always great to see them. And it's even better to see those of you who are new to us. So we look forward to getting acquainted. So Scott, the next slide, please. A little bit about the Dibble Institute. These are Charlie and Helen Dibble, our founders. And I use this slide because often people say, how did you get that name and who's really behind you? So Charlie started this organization when he realized that many of his young friends were either not confident about getting and finding a long-lasting love and establishing a family, or they were actually hurting because their own parents and their relationships were going south. So Charlie, this has been in the 80s, called around to the leading researchers of the day, and guess what? He called PrEP. He called Scott Stanley and Howie Markman to ask what they knew about establishing long-lasting, healthy relationships and marriage. So the Dibble Institute and PrEP Inc. have a long, long relationship. So today, next slide, the Dibble Institute is all around the country. Our programs are used all around the country. It used to be even last year, that this form had some blank states on it, but now we have clients everywhere. And as you can see, our very conservative estimate is that we, royal we, meaning you, because we are not direct service providers, are educating over 115,000 youth every year. And that's really an underestimation, but it's one we feel comfortable with. We're a mission-driven nonprofit, and that's what we're going to talk about next is our mission. Now we're going to take down all those hands, and the way I explain our mission to people, you can read what it is officially here: empowering teens and young adults with knowledge and research-based skills to successfully navigate their intimate relationships. But here's how I do it. How many of you, okay, ready, hand on your hand there, right, hand on the hand raise. How many of you work with young people who either want or have love lives? They aspire to a romantic relationship or they have a romantic relationship. How many of you are working with those kids today? Right. And for those of you who don't work directly with youth, how many of you know young people who either aspire to or have romantic relationships? Yeah, not all kids for sure, but most kids. Right now it's 25%. I think that's because some people haven't found their hands yet, because when I do this in public, like, everybody raises their hands, right? Everybody, young people, it's a normal part of development that you start looking for a romantic partner and thinking about how to make that work. Hey, let's put down those hands. So how many times have you seen a young person's love life get in the way of them fulfilling their own goals and dreams? How many times have they made a poor choice? Maybe they had to drop out of school. Maybe it just took them down a wrong path. So raise your hand if you've seen a young person's love life get in the way of their successfully doing what they want to in their own lives. Yeah, it's not irrelevant, right? Your love life. It's a precursor for many important other skills that we have in life, many other important life skills. Right now it's about 23%, but I can also tell you that when I do this in back, 2019 days, the whole room would raise their hands, because it's not hard to see how a poor decision around your romantic life can influence so much else of your life. And so the last question I ask, and I'm not going to ask it here, but is if you had research-based materials that were fun and interactive that dealt with this topic that's important but seldom addressed, is that something you would like? And again, the room explodes. Yes, that's what we want. So that's what the Dibble Institute does. We're a national nonprofit educational publisher in the space of intimate relationships. All right, our core values, Scott, the next slide. So we're big fans of science. As I said, there's nobody, Mr. and Mrs. Dibble started this organization, and Charlie really put us down the path of using research as our bellwether. And just like we've seen in the pandemic, as science learns more, findings evolve, we change our approach and course, and that's what we are doing all the time. We take great pride, not in a bad way, but we're very pleased that we're able to keep our materials up to date. So when people teach them, they know that they're teaching the most recent social science that we know. So we're big fans of research. And the next slide, we're also big fans of stable, safe, and nurturing families. Every family, most families start with a love story. It might be fleeting for sure, but most relationships or most families start with a love story. And so we're hoping to help young people develop the skills they need to make safe, stable, and nurturing families, because that's really the best place to raise kids. So that's that. And finally, we believe that relationship education is for everyone. It doesn't matter who you love, it doesn't matter what color you are, what age you are, where you came from. All of our relationships can get better through relationship education. So we write our programs to be very inclusive, very culturally responsive, so that they can appeal to the broadest number of young people possible. So that's about the Dibble Institute. As you can tell, I'm happy to talk about it at any time, and I'll have my email at the end of the thing. Happy to chat more. But I'm really pleased to introduce my colleague and friend, Scott Stanley, Dr. Scott Stanley. There he is. He's a professor and co-director of the Center for Marital and Family Studies at the University of Denver. He's widely published, very smart, knows done amazing research, and what we're really here today to talk about is he's done many studies on cohabitation, commitment, and relationship development. And I'm sure if you're working with young people, the questions rise all the time, like, what's the difference between marriage and cohabitation? Who cares? Who does it hurt or help? So these are all questions that we're all dealing with, and that's why we asked Scott to be part of this. He has a popular blog, so if you're a blog reader, check out Sliding versus Deciding. It's slidingvsdeciding.com. He populates it every week or two, and it's really a fun thing to look at. And speaking of fun, he's like super amusing, and I hope he tells us his story about how major appliance purchases are an indicator of marital strength and satisfaction. Thank you, Scott, for coming today.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the great introduction, and for knowing you and Dibble all these years. I mean, wow, such a long time ago when we first talked, and all this great work done, all these people served through Dibble and through PrEP. So just really proud to be associated with UK and your colleagues and Dibble. And I'm excited to be here today with everybody that's tuned in. On the appliance point, so one of the things that I got interested in a long time ago in the 80s was the subject of commitment. What does commitment mean? How do you think about commitment in a relationship? What does it matter? over the years, a lot of focus on sort of the things that tell you something about the commitment that two people have together or that a person has to their partner. And then increasingly, so Howard Markman and I have been including work on commitment in our work and things we do at PrEP for a long time. In 2000, Galina Rhodes came to the University of Denver, and she and I started working together. And that really, there was a great corner turned there into really thinking a lot more about the formation of commitment. And that got us, was already fairly interested in the subject of cohabitation. And it turned out, I didn't set out to be a researcher of cohabitation, although Galina and I have published many articles on, many research articles on cohabitation. But it turned out to be a really great window in thinking about the nature of commitment. Now, back to appliances for a second. One of the things that's true about commitment in general is when people have a strong commitment to another, it's reflected in their behavior. And there was, I don't know if this was ever even a like seriously published study, but I saw a finding, this is so many years ago, but it made so much sense that people tend to only buy an appliance. I mean, think of all the things you might buy with somebody that you're not planning to be with in the future, or that you're not sure you're going to be with in the future. You might buy some gadgets, you might buy, you might rent some movies, you might watch Netflix, you might do any number of things, but you're not going to buy an appliance because an appliance is like, it's a long-term thing. You don't buy a washer and a dryer with somebody that you're not thinking of being with for a while and maybe for a long time. So it was just a really interesting comment on how even at very basic levels, our behavior reflects how we're thinking about a relationship. Now, I just want to quickly comment, a lot of the research that we've done at the University of Denver over the years is funded by different branches of NIH. So there's a little acknowledgement to some grants there, and some of the specific studies I may mention, or a lot of the studies I'll mention, have their roots and data sets from those fundings. And there's my two major colleagues. And again, Galina Rhodes, this area, what I'm presenting right now, this is an area where she and I have written a lot, thought a lot, published a lot of blog articles, a lot of journal articles, and a lot of talks. So this is really a lot about work that we've done together. Let's start off with the state of things related to marriage, relationship formation. And I'm not going to present a lot of detail here because you can read these things and there's people that present this kind of theme and comment better than me. But here's one of the changes that we're all very aware of that is linked to so many other societal changes, that the average age of first marriage has gone steadily up over the last few decades. Now, you might notice if you go back far enough on that chart, it was much higher than people often think. A lot of people think that this story sort of begins in the 50s when it was around 20 or so in terms of the average age of marriage. But that was kind of a phenomenon coming out of World War II. But since then, the age of marriage has been going up and up and up, and in all industrial societies around the world. I think the average age of first marriage in one of the Scandinavian countries now is like in the early 40s. That's just kind of fascinating to think about. Now, that change is about marriage, but it really embodies a lot of the whole change that we see in society. It's related to the birth of the whole movement about people sort of taking more time to grow up if they have the resources to. Other people kind of have to grow up fast if they're not in a resource-rich environment. But the whole way that time has stretched out now, because it used to be, people would kind of graduate from high school, find a mate, start working life together, get a job, some order of those things, and then they're building a life together. And now what's really happened that affects the work that many of us do, and that's a very interesting kind of thing related to research, is people have this extensive period of time now on average where they kind of haven't really settled down. not only in terms of work, but especially in this context, in terms of a relationship, in terms of a commitment to a partner. Again, it's linked to many things. It's linked to financial insecurity. I think it's partly linked to the divorce revolution in the 70s. There was so much divorce that people became really rattled about marriage and started to put it off and delay. And one of the things that I think people were doing there is sort of not only being skittish about marriage, but wanting to make sure they had developed themselves and their own resources enough before. Many other things go into that delay. Birth control, all these major changes in society are factors in this curve. But the most basic one for a lot of what we're thinking about here today is that people have this extensive period of time where they're in relationships, and some of the relationships are pretty serious or have pretty serious consequences, but they're not married. They're not like settled down in terms of that clarity, maybe about commitment together. I call this period the big delay. I'll also say I started calling this the big delay a few years ago and realized for a lot of people now, it's not even the delay. There's more, and it's hard to know until you know, there's more people now who will never marry. It used to be, 90-some% of folks would eventually marry. Any number you hear about that now, it's just a projection, it's a guess, but the number's coming down. There were some benefits of the big delay. There are some benefits, people making more careful choices. I mentioned what I call self-insuring, sort of like, well, I'm going to get my job stuff together, so if this doesn't work. I mean, those are some things people see as benefits, and then there's also some consequences. Maybe people can get a little too much relationship experience. And one of the most complicated things I think that affects people in their future family trajectory or marital trajectory, if that's the path they're on and where they want to be, is that a lot of people, once they are ready, like to really settle down with a particular person with a lifetime commitment or a big time commitment, they already have children in tow from other partners. And those of you that work in any of this field, this is like one of the most complicated, biggest challenges now. It's just a great complexity now for people navigating this sort of time and part of life. Here's another big change, and I just wanted to put it up because it's probably my favorite graph I've ever seen a researcher, a couple of researchers make, but it is relevant also. This is a graph from a figure from a paper by Rosenfeld and Thomas about searching for a mate and where people meet the person they eventually marry. And what you can see in this chart is just look at it's almost like a COVID chart. We're all used to looking at those these days, but look at the way that it's just skyrocketed how people meet online now. And everything else is declining and meeting online is increasing. I think that has real serious implications. One, it increases the pool, the people that are available to somebody. It also allows people, if they choose, to be kind of really careful in who they select or to kind of vet people about certain characteristics. But it also means people spend a lot of time sort of trying to figure out somebody else who they're not even actually seeing in person yet, where there's a lot more room for ambiguity, which I'll talk about in a minute. So here, a few foundational thoughts about commitment, because I'll come back to these three points in various ways as I talk. One is that commitment can be thought about in two dimensions, and I think of this mostly as a researcher in terms of how we might measure it. You can measure commitment in terms of dedication, which can be thought of as how much I want to be with this person or how invested, how into this goal in life I am. In the case of a relationship, it's I want a future with you. We have an identity together. I make us a priority. It's all these kinds of things that you think about the want to part. On the other hand, there's another really important part of commitment, which I like the term constraint. Another researcher, Mike Johnson, who's done a lot of great work in the area of commitment, sociologist years ago. He likes this basic distinction between dedication and constraint as well. Constraint refers to more the factors related to commitment that would keep somebody somewhere when they might want to leave. There's sort of things that make it harder to leave. One may or may not want to leave, but constraint's the part of commitment that makes it hard to leave. Another point, and I'll come back to this because I think this is my favorite one-liner that I've ever had about commitment. When a person makes a commitment, they're making a choice to give up other choices. So hang on to that thought. We'll come back to it and really think about it, because anytime you're making a commitment, whether small or large, you're choosing among options and you're choosing one and giving up some others. And lastly, why commitment? Why does commitment matter? I think commitment matters a lot because it secures attachment. It does a lot of other things, but if you think about people having important emotional attachments to other people in life, important connections to family, friends, lovers, spouse, commitment secures the attachment. It's what makes it safe to invest. And for commitment to do that, it has to be clearly signaled. It has to be evident. It has to be something that each can see. Now, I'm going to ask just a couple of questions as we go of you, the audience. But one of the things you see these days in the whole sort of dating, mating market is a massive amount of ambiguity. I think things used to actually be pretty much clearer in days gone by, and now there is a lot of ambiguity. What are some of the things, what are some of the manifestations you see in relationships today that reflect how romantic relationships are more ambiguous than they used to be? See if you can generate a few ideas about that, and then I'll put up the list that I like. Oh, and you can type your answers into the question. So it's not exactly a question, but it's like you're playing Jeopardy. You're gonna give the answer to my question in the question box if you'd like.
So Scott, here's some answers. We just hang out. Younger generations tend to be more irresponsible and just don't want to be held accountable. The ease of the hookup culture, we're just talking. The whole idea of, quote, situationship. Men used to initiate dates. Now it's, hey, let's hang out. Now it's unclear. The culture of hooking up, they aren't labeled as formally. They refuse to use the word dating. Rather, they say seeing someone's. There's no titles. Lots of more casual, no strings attached relationships. Multiple partners, friends with benefits. Again, lots and lots around the no labels. No one's upfront about their feelings. I don't want to catch feelings, so I'm just talking. No defining the relationship conversation.
It's great.
It's young people watching their parents go through messy divorces and are afraid to do the same. They just are afraid to be vulnerable. And sexual liberty and sexual ambiguity is more prevalent now.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great list. So here's some of the ones, just mentioned a bunch. I think this first one's kind of fascinating. I wrote a lot about this. Ended up in Psychology Today, the actual print magazine, a USA Today headline. A lot of people just being confused about, well, we're going out Friday, but is this a date? Like, it means something real different if it's a date, which it does. But you can find websites where people will tell you whether what you're doing is a date or not. I think that's pretty great. Soft breakups. Breakups are ambiguous as well. Galena and I have thought a lot about this and talked about this, that people don't break up cleanly so much anymore either. They're sort of like, well, I'll put you on the back burner here and just sort of watch you on Facebook and see what happens. You never know. Hookup, the whole point is kind of ambiguity. Just talking, I first really heard about that concept from Dr. Scott Sibley, who's done some work on it. I think it's just fascinating. We're just talking. Well, you're probably not just talking. I mean, I think that's a very interesting phenomena. Ghosting, which I'll just say, I put it on this list, but if you ever know somebody that's being ghosted, ghosting is actually fundamentally not ambiguous. If somebody's ghosting you, you pretty well know what it means, that they're not interested in you. And cohabitation, I think, is like it's quintessentially ambiguous, which is kind of the point, which I'll get to. And in contrast, if you go back some decades now, but used to be a lot more defined scripts and steps and stages and a lot less ambiguity, and people could kind of position the other person or our relationship better in sort of the scripts that people were on. So there's some freedoms in the scripts being sort of let go, and there not being as many steps and stages, but there's a cost. And one of the costs is different kinds of asymmetry. And there's two kinds of asymmetry that I think are really important to think about. One is asymmetrical commitment, and we've published a lot on asymmetrical commitment. So I don't know, 5 or 6 articles. I think it's much easier to have a relationship where two people are not on the same page about commitment without the more committed person even knowing it, because there's so many fewer cues. And asymmetrically committed relationships are really difficult. They tend to be a real struggle for people, and it can take a long time to know that somebody's not as into you as you are into them, which links asymmetrical commitment to a concept that's big in economics. Several Nobel Prizes have been won related to it, which is asymmetrical information. And that comes from a whole literature about markets where there's buyers and sellers. George Akerlof is a famous economist who won a Nobel for this, really talking about the market for used cars and how the buyer doesn't know as much as the seller does about the car, and that presents a basic fundamental difficulty in a market. Well, this is true in dating markets as well. People have a lot of reasons, especially when there's this long time horizon, for when you're maybe wanting to settle down or not wanting to settle down, or maybe you want to disguise, maybe a person wants to disguise what their real interest is. Maybe it's only sexual, but I need to tell you that it's more. There's a lot of reasons why the information could be not clearly shared and asymmetrical as well. And that supports, in the midst of all this ambiguity, where society isn't forcing clarity in terms of the scripts and how things work, a lot of ambiguity makes asymmetry and commitment more likely. And sometimes people find that out in fairly unpleasant ways. So in this dating pool,
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So can you illustrate what an asymmetrical, with two people, tell us what that actually looks like. What does it look like on the ground, an asymmetrical relationship?
So it could look like one's not as willing to say anything about a future, not willing to avoid discussions about whether there might be a future, whether we're in a relationship, whether we are being exclusive, because that could be very asymmetrical, right? Well, you don't actually know that we're not exclusive, but I know that we're not exclusive. You can have that, or you could just have just a basic difference in how committed am I to you on a day in, day out basis in terms of one of the elements of dedication is being willing to sacrifice for your partner, to give something else up for what's good for them. Well, there's a lot of relationships where things like that are not even, and that's not completely abnormal. It's never completely even. But when I talk about an asymmetrically committed relationship, people are fundamentally on a different page, and there's one person that's overcommitted to the other, overcommitted given the low commitment of the other. And they may be figuring it out, they may be starting to figure it out, or they may yet be kind of clueless about it. And here's a point, I won't go further into this because this isn't a complete talk about asymmetrical commitment, but you can find a lot of things that we've written, including blog articles about this. Oh, one of them's in the resource for this talk. But think about this, because this is also related to power. The person that's the most committed in an asymmetrically committed relationship has the least power. This goes back to a principle framed by a family researcher decades and decades ago named Waller, who he talked about the principle of least interest. In any given transaction, deal, whatever, the person that's least interested has the most power. So this can be the source of a real power dynamic in a relationship. And it's directly fed, it's possible, it's more of it's possible when there's so much ambiguity about relationships. So
one more thing.
Yep.
So Sarita explains, and I think this is a good point, that the term talking was coined by African Americans in the late 80s, early 90s, and meant to signify a stage between dating and being in a more serious relationship. So maybe that just talking has changed its the nuances or the definition has changed, but back in the day, it was meant to be like on the ladder.
I think that's a wonderful anecdote and a point of, I mean, that's a really interesting point about history. And it actually fits the current use, and it sets up this next slide pretty well, because if you think about the dating market, one of the difficulties is just talking's great when you have two people that sort of both know that's what we're doing. We're just sort of like feeling this out. I'm potentially interested in more. I read yours potentially interested in more, and we're just sort of talking and learning more about each other. That's wonderful. It's less great when one thing, this is asymmetry again, when one thinks, well, we're just kind of in this just talking stage. And as Scott Sibley has told me in their qualitative work, and anybody would know this, you know, a lot of times people kind of find out, oh, I didn't know you were just talking with 5 other people. So you could have, again, people really just sort of missing the knowledge about where the other's at, and reading this as this is just a stage moving along to the next, but we're not in the same place. And I think one of the complexities of the market these days is that we have in the same market, and the behavior could look similar. You have stayers, players, and delayers. And the stayers are the people that are, you know, they're looking for the one or a one. They're really looking for, or they're open to it happening, a secure, committed relationship. The players aren't looking for that at all. They're seeking, but you know, they're seeking something different. But they may not want, if they detect they're with the stayer, they may want to not let it be clear that they're a player, right? So they might want to signal something that's a false signal. And then delayers, I think this is one of the most obvious, or not less obvious, but really interesting groups here with this really long period of delay. We have people that really, they're determined to not settle down till they're like 30 or 32 or 40. And they don't actually want to meet the one during this time because they've decided that's not good. I don't want to settle down too early, which is interesting because it's a false belief. They may have found the best person they're ever going to find at age 23, but if they're so committed to like wait till 32, they might be blowing it. And besides, their options are going to be fewer at 32. But some of the delayers are sort of like then become temporary players, even though they eventually mean to be stayers. And all I want to say about that, because otherwise we could talk the rest of the afternoon about this slide, that's really complicated. That's a real difference than 40 or 50 years ago, when you could probably accurately have a decent assumption that more people than not were on a similar page of kind of looking for a mate. So that's complexity. Now, the one point I want to say about cohabitation related to ambiguity, because we're going to talk more about cohabitation now, is a lot of people miss the fact that, well, 2 things are true. One is cohabiting relationships compared to married relationships are fundamentally, on average, less committed. And sometimes people hear that as sort of a pejorative comment, and it sounds like it could be, and it depends on who's saying it and what context. But on average, you have cohabiting relationships where the couple is very committed. They might just be like not interested or not planning on marriage in terms of doing that whole thing, but they might be just as committed as another couple. But on average, among cohabitors versus married, the married couples on average have formed a much clearer, stronger, unambiguous commitment to the future. And the cohabiting couples will be in a great heterogeneous mass, many more kind of positions within that pool of folks where commitment on average is quite a bit lower. And what I like to say about cohabitation, for those that are really focused on that or into that or see it as something they want to do, it's not like the low commitment is actually a bug, as sort of marriage folks often talk about it. For them, it's a feature. It's like it's just talking, but sort of living together. I coined a term maybe 5 or 6 years ago that I think is pretty apt for a lot of people today, which is called cohabitating. So instead of cohabiting or cohabitating, as some people would say, cohabitating is where a lot of people are at. So that it doesn't really mean this, it's more that we're not there. And for some people, it just means we're not there economically. And for others, it's like, well, you're somebody I'll live with for now. But I'm either not sure about a future, or I'm actually sure there isn't a future, but this is convenient, or I want to test something out. There's a financial need that this is meeting. There could be a lot of reasons, or we're just asymmetrically committed, and I don't know yet that you're never going to want to move to marriage, even though that's what I want. So again, there's just a lot of complexity there. I want to say one other thing, and then we're going to just dive right into some key findings about premarital cohabitation. Is this: everything I've said and everything I'm about to say, you should recognize that things differ a lot in this line of research and in the world based on family background, patterns of risk, economic resources. There's huge economic divides now in terms of who's tracking strongly toward marriage, who's less likely to marry. There's real strong patterns in cohabitation versus marriage in terms of economic resources and disadvantage. So all of those things are in the mix. But I want to talk now about something that I think is in a pattern or in a mix. It comes from our research on premarital cohabitation. But this whole idea of sliding versus deciding and how I link that to this whole theme of commitment, I think applies to many things now beyond just cohabitation. So, but that's where it starts. So I want to give you just a sense of that research. The work that Galina and I have done on cohabitation really brings to the fore the issue of timing and sequence, that things develop in a certain time and that sequence in some kinds of ways can matter a lot in terms of what is happening between two people. If you want to study more or read more about research on cohabitation, and these slides will be available in a few days on Dibble's site, here's some of the great scholars, and there's more. It's an annotated a list of just scholars that have done great work in research on cohabitation. So just listing some names there for you. I won't even read them all. But let's talk about the cohabitation effect, because it's an interesting kind of historical point in the literature about marriage. It has been true for decades, and it's only been recently disputed in the last 5 or 10 years that it might not be true, that people who live together before marriage tend to not do as well in marriage on average. So historically, living together before marriage has been associated with greater odds of divorce, lower marital satisfaction, more conflict, poor communication, and actually a host of others sort of not great outcomes in married life. This was a puzzling, I mean, this finding goes back decades and decades, and it was always found. I mean, nothing contrary to it was ever found for decades. That was, by the way, I mean, what's fascinating about that is this belief was also growing throughout this same period of time. While this finding's been around for decades and it's been sort of argued about and pretty mysterious to some people, it's pretty much at odds to what was a growing belief over all these years, which is that living together is like the best thing you could do to improve your chances of success in marriage. 60, 70, 80%, depending on the survey, of people believe that that's true. Like, I don't know anything that people believe as strongly than this that will improve their odds. And it's one of these things where people believe it, and there's been there's been no evidence or virtually no evidence to support the belief. The controversy is a little bit about whether the risk has actually gone away, but there's not any evidence really of the benefit. And most people these days before they marry are going to live together before they get married. So let's think about that. So among a number of researchers, and these are some names that you saw on the list a few minutes ago, a number of people have reported that this effect has weakened or gone away. And in fact, sociologists have expected this effect to go away as cohabitation became more normative. It's not gone away, or at least I don't think it's gone away, and some others don't think it's gone away, although sociologists at the moment are arguing about this. In 2018, two sociologists from Stanford really shook things up, Rosenfeld and Rosler, who came out with a study in the same big data set that many of the sociological scholars use and said, you know what, guess what? The cohabitation effect is actually still here. It's never gone away. There's a bit of a benefit to living together in marriage in the first year, which they said was probably just acclimation. You know, you've already kind of been getting used to that transition. And otherwise, in every other year of marriage, that it was still associated with more divorce. Now, there's an argument going on between Rosenfeld and Rosler and Manning and Cooperberg and Pam Smock. And I'm not going to go into that. I've written in some detail about it in blog articles. But this is an interesting debate. I'm going to skip that slide. I just want to say, though, regardless, there's really not been evidence. There's a couple little pockets of findings suggesting that living together before marriage improves one's odds. So there's this really curious thing where a lot of people believe this thing that there's just not evidence for. So why? Now, there's a couple of things that are pretty well known in the literature about why living together before marriage could be associated with greater risk. And you should recognize, by the way, this isn't a don't live together before marriage talk. I'm using this area to get to points about commitment and how it forms. But one of the factors that's clearly, and maybe the biggest one in all of the literature, is selection effects. And what selection effects in this case is this. It's the stuff that's already baked in: family backgrounds, poverty, difficulties in life, personal vulnerabilities. People that are more likely to live together before marriage are also the same folks that were already more likely, whether they did or not, to struggle in marriage. That's a big deal. It's a big part of the puzzle. There's also some really good evidence. This is fun to talk about in its own right, but just how living together and living together for more time with more people, and a great couple of studies by Axon and Barber decades ago, and I think the finding would still hold. Nobody's gone after it for a while, that it changes how you think. You tend to think the more you've done that, you know, our behavior changes what we believe. Our beliefs affect how we behave. The more we do something, the more we're going to change our beliefs in line with it. And what they were showing in really creative research is that the more people are living together, or living together with more people, or living together for more time, the less they value marriage and child rearing, and other sort of beliefs and attitudes change over time because of their behavior. Now, our theory, mine and Galina's and colleague Howard Markman, the theory that we really put forward, the hypothesis, is called the inertia hypothesis. Let me define what inertia is. So imagine you're in physics class in high school for a second. Inertia is the property of an object that speaks to how much energy or effort it's going to take to make it do something different than what it's doing. So if it's at rest, how much energy would you have to put into it to make it move? If it's already moving a certain direction, how much energy would you have to apply to get it to move another direction? I've put up a bowling ball and tennis balls here, and you can imagine that that bowling ball has a lot more inertia than the tennis balls. If I kick a bowling ball, it's going to hurt because it's going to take a lot of effort to get it to start moving. If I kick a tennis ball, it's just going to like bounce off my foot and go away. Big difference in inertia. Now just think about that. Think about physics for a moment. I have a quiz for you. So just give some answers. Let me ask it this way so you can do the show of hands, and then Kay can tell me what kind of hands. Raise your hand if you think dating has more inertia than living together.
Okay, we're going to give them a few more seconds. Currently, 10% of the people think that dating has more inertia than living together.
All right. Correct answer, living together. So think about this. When you move in with somebody, you're starting to buy things, you're starting to more directly share a life together. When you start living with somebody, you start to do a lot of things that would make it take more energy than it would have if you'd remained dating, not living together, to change the direction you're on in life, to change the direction of the relationship, to even break up. This is a direct extension from all the work that I've done in commitment over the years related to the concept of constraint. People tend to think most about dedication when they think about commitment. They don't think enough about constraints. When people move in together, they are greatly increasing and then tend to rapidly continue to increase the constraints on staying together. That's the theory of inertia related to the premarital cohabitation effect. And really what the basic idea is that some people may have made it harder to break up before they really decided they wanted to stay. Let that sink in a bit, because the prediction here is that if people hadn't already sort of figured out their future together before they made it harder to leave, maybe they get stuck. Maybe there's more people that get stuck by that, or it reinforces a relationship continuing that otherwise maybe wouldn't have. So that's the whole idea of inertia. So inertia has a few specific predictions, and let me mention my favorite one, because this was a pure theoretical prediction that goes back decades now. 25 years ago or so, first had this thought that inertia should be a non-factor for couples who have mutual plans to marry. For example, they're engaged before they moved in together. It's obvious they have mutual plans for a life together if they're already married, so that group's not too interesting here. It's the difference between those who already had made that clear and come to that point before they moved in versus that became clear after we moved in together. So there's the befores and the afters. The afters are people that we only moved in together after we had already decided we had a long-term commitment, especially engagement. It's very easy to measure. That prediction, oops, lost my mouse cursor. That prediction, it looks like this. Those that were already engaged or had clear mutual plans, they have to agree, or it has to have been mutual. Clear mutual plans for a marriage, for a life together, before we moved in together, they look entirely different than people who started to live together. On average, everything's on average when you're talking to a researcher. The people who started to live together before that clarity about commitment, before that massive signal about commitment to a future together that marriage is, those that move in together before that look to be at risk. And that's controlling for everything under the sun you can imagine that could account for selection. You can't perfectly account for selection. You can't ever prove anything about this unless you can experimentally manipulate it. And since we're not like gonna assign people in a random assignment study to either live together or not, or live together before they're engaged or not, we can't do that study. Nobody can do that study. But this is a very strong a priori hypothesis, and the data that supports that is in at least 7 studies in 6 different samples in the literature. That's a pretty strong set of findings. Here's further support. So constraints predict staying together net dedication. So this is a great paper by Galina in 2010, where we're looking at a lot of commitment factors in a national sample and other factors related to the relationship and what predicts. Even controlling for how dedicated I am to my partner, how into my partner I am, and vice versa, and controlling for that and other things. How constrained we are tells us something about whether we're going to stay together, which makes sense. It's adding that inertia to the relationship that propels it to have a future. And one of the things, and this is one of the most beautiful set of analyses in this literature, I think, that Galina did and published in 2012, is we had this really nice national sample where we were following people over time, including people from before to after moving in together. And so we're interested, well, what happens between dedication and constraint when people move in together? And here's a couple of patterns from that paper. dedication when people moved in together on average in this sample just leveled off. This is a 1 to 7 scale on the left there. It didn't keep going in the way you would expect it to keep going up for people normally premaritally, who are going to end up over 6 or so on this scale usually. It just sort of stopped growing. Now we live together, and we measured constraints in a couple of different ways. I'm just showing you one of the kinds here. Constraints jump up. That's what that space between those two bars means. So we had this transition, we now live together. And now we have a lot more constraint, and constraints have changed in slope, which means they're now accumulating much more rapidly. That's exactly what we predict. That's exactly what we expect from this finding. So those are just a couple of findings that really support this kind of literature. Now, you would think, and this is where it becomes relevant to thinking about lots of different transitions, but just think about this for cohabitation for a second, and then I'm going to move to making some sort of big picture points about the nature of commitment and the timing of it related to important transitions in relationships. So if cohabitation is associated with increased constraints, people would be careful about that, right? No, they're not careful about it, because people have been told it's just a great test. And again, I start to sound a little more pejorative there, but it's not. It's like people have been told for decades that cohabitation is cost-free. I'll tell you this, there's no relationship on the planet where I would believe that once they moved in together, they would have less constraint than they had beforehand, that they would have an easier time to decide, you're not the one, or this isn't working out, I want to move on. Everybody's going to have an increase in constraints once they move in.
Scott,
Yeah, go ahead.
2 things. You have about 5 more minutes. And
Got it.
can you just give some examples of what a constraint is? Like, what does that look like on the ground?
So one of the really big ones is, well, one of us would have to find another place. So we define cohabitation very clearly in our research as you are sharing a single place without each of you having your own place to go back to live to. That's a big constraint, because if we were not going to make it, if we're going to decide we're going to break up, well, then one of us got to move out. One of us has to buy some stuff. Maybe we have to divide up things we bought together. Maybe friends and family now kind of expect us to continue, so that social pressure can be a constraint. Just finances, I can't support myself, so now it's hard to move out. That's a constraint. Dividing things up, a child, we now have a child together, can be, of course, a big constraint at that point, that, well, breaking up with you might mean I hardly see my child as much anymore, or I have to do all the work with the child. So all of these things, lots of different kinds of constraints, but the singular point of the prediction there is that moving in together made it harder to break up. And for a lot of people, making it harder to break up before they'd actually decided, this is my future, this is where I want to be. That's a really important nugget in this. And what we see in the research, Wendy Manning and Pam Smock published a great paper in 2005 where they are talking about qualitative research on cohabitation. And basically what they describe is, like, a lot of people who live together, more than half in their work, could not describe a point where they actually talked about it and made a decision. It was gradual. First, I was moving some stuff over there. I started to leave this stuff over. Maybe I had a drawer, started to leave some clothes over, and a charger for my phone. Maybe there's just a sort of gradual, more and more, and then one day somebody's lease is up and they just sort of don't even notice, or they haven't made a clear decision, and now we're living together. Joe Lindsay, an Australian researcher, has a great study on this published in 2000 from data from the 90s, where she describes in beautiful detail in these qualitative stories, examples, how this was so true for a lot of couples then related to cohabitation. In our own quantitative work, we find that 2/3 of couples that are, 2/3 of people that are cohabiting with their partner essentially say something more like they slid into it than made a decision about it. So let's talk about just a key implication about this, because you'll get the essence of sliding versus deciding related to commitment. And everything I've said applies to any sort of major relationship transition where somebody could potentially have fewer options afterwards than they had before. Having a baby, sex, cohabitation is really clear, I think, in the literature and the way we're studying it in terms of breaking down commitment. But this sort of model holds for any kind of transition somebody's about to take that could lead them with fewer options than they had before the transition. And speed adds to the risk. Sharon Sassler has done really nice work looking at the tempo of how things develop in relationships. So speed, timing, and what happens adds to the risk. But here's the punchline for the whole point here. First off, sliding is not always bad. There's a lot of times people slide into like a great place to be. Like they weren't making a decision, their partner wasn't making a decision, they didn't make a decision together as a couple, but they maybe landed, they just slid into a place, and I don't mean just with cohabitation, I mean in all kinds of places they could make a decision. They're in the right spot, they're in a good place, they're gonna be fine. But then other times what people are doing, I think a lot of times by sliding instead of deciding, either as an individual or in terms of the process between the two of us, is they're giving up options before they've made a choice, which is ironic and kind of remarkable because the last thing anybody wants to do now as things have developed and as people are this day and age in our society is they don't want to give up choices. They don't want to give up options. They don't want to lose a chance. And a lot of times because of how people approach relationships, they're giving up options before they've made a choice. One more comment. I said at the start that commitments are decisions. You can really, this is where the sliding deciding phrase came from. I got the sliding word from Manning and Smock. It was just such a great description and it fit what Lindsay was describing, which was all about ambiguity. And that's where the sliding deciding came from. Decisions, commitments are decisions. So there's a decisional way to be, and there's this sort of letting it happen way to be. And commitment is making a choice to give up other choices. And here's the distinction. Sliding, in many cases, in important transitions in relationships, has the same implication for the increase in constraints, but it's sliding into an increase in constraints instead of deciding to be constrained. When I make a commitment to somebody, especially if it's a commitment in marriage, a commitment for life, but if I make a big commitment to somebody, I'm choosing to be constrained. I know that I'm doing that. I'm deciding. Choosing to be constrained is part of what making a commitment in a relationship really is. Sliding is becoming constrained without having made a clear choice. Thank you.
Scott, thank you so much for that presentation. I have questions that we have too little time to answer. So we will get back to those people individually and perhaps publish an FAQ on our when this is archived. So if you could throw up the next slide.
That'd be great.
So that was great. People were saying, wow, I wish, there was more time. But we don't want to get you guys all back to work, which is we're all committed to. So Scott, can I get the next slide? Anyway.
I'm sorry.
Right. You'll be getting a survey
you
as you leave us today. Please let us know what you thought of this webinar and what ideas you have for future webinars. If you have questions, let us know. That's our main postbox, relationship skills at Dibble. Next slide. We have CEUs available. So for those of you who want to study more in relationship education and need CEUs, check out our Dibble Institute /CEUs. We've pulled together several pots of our webinars and arranged with a company to give CEU credits. They're free. The CEU credits are not, but taking the CEUs are. So check that out. Next slide. Oh yeah, stay in touch all the normal ways. So, we're everywhere, as it were. Okay, next one. And finally, next month, which will be super interesting as kind of a way to build on this, we're having people from the National Family and Marriage Research Center talk about what's currently happening with young people today, their experiences and expectations of relationships. So it'll be a really nice building block on this. So thank you all for your time. We wish you well, and we look forward to seeing you in February. Thank you.